Russia's stated priority for 2026 was simple enough to draw on a map: take all of Donetsk oblast. An internal plan set the date, the 1st of April 2026, and the officials who described it to RBC Ukraine in January called that timeline unrealistic even then. By the 22nd of July, Russian forces had gained a net 31 square miles in all of 2026. That figure comes from the Institute for the Study of Wars mapping, not from a claim out of Kiev. 31 square miles across 7 months of Russia's main effort of the year. Something broke the Russian assault in the Donbas. The harder question is why Moscow cannot rebuild it. That answer is not in the trench lines. It sits hundreds of miles behind them in refinery units built on imported equipment that no longer has a supplier. The ground being fought over has a name in Ukrainian planning: the Fortress Belt: Kramatorsk, Kostiantynivka, Drushkivka, Sloviansk, the most heavily fortified line in Donetsk and the logistics hub of the entire oblast. The slowdown is easiest to see year against year. In July of 2025, Russian forces took roughly 176 square miles. In July of 2026, 15. Count every infiltration group that slipped past the line and held nothing, and the figure rises to 47. Both numbers come from the same ISW mapping. You can probably guess which number Moscow published. The Russian Ministry of Defense amplified a claim of 859 square miles for the half-year, more than 20 times the net gain ISW mapped for the entire year to that date. That gap is not a rounding error, and it was not invented by the men doing the walking. At ground level, the pace has a number too. The Center for Strategic and International Studies measured advances of about 55 yards a day at Kostiantynivka, 75 at Pokrovsk, 100 at Sloviansk, 100 yards a day. CSIS placed those among the slowest advances of any war in the past century. The cities tell it another way. By late July, a Western official put roughly 80% of Kostiantynivka's urban center under Russian control, while cautioning that the numbers are hard to confirm. Sloviansk and Kramatorsk are being flattened by glide bombs, artillery and drones not taken. Pokrovsk shows what that costs in time. 21 months of frontal assault, from March of 2024 to December of 2025, to take most of one city about 31 miles of advance at 70 yards a day. Russia's defense ministry claimed neighboring Minohrad on the 28th of December 2025. ISW has recorded no significant advance west of it since. It costs more than time. In 2025, Russian forces paid something on the order of 200 casualties per square mile taken. In the first half of 2026, more than 9,600. That ratio comes from the analyst Mick Ryan, drawing on Russia Matters and the Ukrainian General Staff. The casualty baseline is Ukrainian, and it carries the caveats any wartime figure from an interested party carries. The ratio is the argument, not the absolute number. 48 times the price for the same square mile. The equipment bill is firmer, counted from photographs. More than 1,700 combat vehicles lost on the advance from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk alone, roughly 10 brigades worth. CSIS attributes the freeze to two things: drone interdiction and simple attrition. Its exchange ratio for the first half of 2026 runs near 8-1, against 2 or 3-1 earlier in the war. But the expensive part of the Russian method was already dying before that. Bakhmut fell in May of 2023, after roughly a year of infantry wave assaults. Avdiivka fell on the 17th of February 2024, after 4 months. The 1st Guards Tank Army and the 41st Combined Arms Army, massive artillery preparation, FAB 500 and FAB 1500 glide bombs and mechanized assault behind them. That method has a Soviet pedigree and a Soviet appetite. A declassified CIA assessment of Soviet ground forces found that a division at readiness carried fuel for only about 3 to 3.5 days of intense offensive combat without resupply. Everything past day 3 came from army and front level, tanker trucks and rail. The doctrine those divisions trained for assumed 12 to 25 miles a day on a broad front. The price of running it in Ukraine showed up immediately. Around 400 armored vehicles were lost in the first 2 weeks at Avdiivka and Marinka, a Ukrainian estimate reported in November of 2023, with the caveats that implies. Taking a fortified city is a combined arms problem. and Soviet doctrine answered it with the Storm Detachment, a motor rifle battalion, a tank company, an engineer company, self-propelled guns working as one thing. Remove a piece and the rest dies fast. Grozny. January of 1995 is the case every officer studies. The 131st Maykop Brigade went in without dismounted infantry covering its vehicles and lost 102 of its 120 armoured personnel carriers and 20 of 26 tanks in the opening assault. By the autumn of 2023, Russian units were already conserving armour and moving in smaller groups. By the spring of 2024, Carnegie's analysts recorded motorcycles and light vehicles as the dominant means of getting forward. The expensive method was corroding before the refineries ever became a target. Then Ukraine went after the fuel itself. In 2026, every one of Russia's 10 or 11 largest refineries has been hit. The Ukrainian General Staff counts at least 194 strikes on refining targets this year and puts the sector's losses near $13.5 billion since August of 2025. The tools are cheap and specific. The An-196 Luti is a one-way attack drone with a warhead of 110 to 165 pounds and a published range of 600 to 1200 miles. It has struck targets around 1,000 miles out. The FP-1 from the Ukrainian firm Firepoint is a deep strike drone listed at about 1,000 miles and roughly $55,000 a unit, and on the 6th of July 2026, one hit Omsk at more than 1,500 miles, well past its own catalogue figure. The FP-5, called Flamingo, is a cruise missile carrying about 2,500 pounds with a claimed range of 1,800 miles, and its maker has cited numbers as high as 3,000. That last figure is the manufacturer's own. The R-360 Neptune carries 330 pounds to 175 miles. The long Neptune variant reaches 600. A primary unit, the crude distillation stage, is comparatively straightforward to repair. Ukraine stopped aiming at those. The strikes moved to the secondary units. Catalytic reforming, including the LCH-3511D 1000 units at Moscow and Saratov. Isomerization, vis braking. Those are the deep conversion stages. They are more complex, and they were built on imported equipment. How much of Russian refining is actually offline depends entirely on who is counting. The Ukrainian General Staff said 42.7% of designed capacity was disabled as of the 4th of July. Finland's president, Alexander Stubb, put the reduction in Russia's ability to produce and export fuel at 40%. The International Energy Agency said more than 20. President Zelensky, in May, said 10 to 20. Tenet Research said 58%, about 4.3 million barrels a day, the outlier in the set. The independent measurements sit lower and are harder to argue with. Reuters found idled or reduced plants amounting to roughly a quarter of total capacity, with fuel output down 25% year-on-year in June. Bloomberg, using EA Analytics data, put July processing near 3.6 million barrels a day, the lowest since 2002 and about a third below the normal seasonal level. One caveat cuts against all of it. Capacity hit is not throughput lost. In 2025, 20% offline at the peak translated into a volume drop of only about 6%, because there was idle capacity to absorb it. Volume can come back. The equipment is another matter. The Moscow refinery at Kapotnya, run by Gazprom Neft, was assessed by industry sources in June as needing at least 6 months of repair, possibly staying offline through the end of 2026. Manpower is not the constraint. Secondary units run on licensed Western equipment, and the two names that matter, UOP in the United States and ABB in Switzerland, are not taking new Russian orders. At Norsy, the KK-1 cracking unit has sat idle since January because the expertise to restart it does not exist in-house. Gasoline output there fell 40%. A hydro-treating or cracking unit costs hundreds of millions to build. Moscow's Euro complex ran past $1 billion. And through 2026, Ukraine began striking the same plants repeatedly, stretching every repair schedule already running. Inside Russia, it shows up at the pump. More than 50 regions imposed rationing or tiered access. Officials and priority services served first. Fuel quality was downgraded to Euro 3 standard with additives, none of which means the system is broken. Carnegie's assessment is that Russian refining is battered but not broken, and that the gasoline actually available is the outcome of a race between Ukrainian drones and Russian repair crews. In 2025, despite the strikes, annual processing fell only about 3%. Belarusian imports and lower-grade product have covered part of the gap. The race is real. What changed in 2026 is what the Russian army does with the fuel it still gets. Massed mechanized assault has been largely abandoned since the middle of 2025. What replaced it is 2 to 5 men on foot, moving under thermal blankets, sometimes on motorcycles or all-terrain vehicles, infiltrating instead of attacking. Viktor Trehubov, spokesman for Ukraine's Kortitsia group of forces, said in late July that Russian units have nearly stopped using armor, and that no one attempts suicidal assaults anymore because they cannot counter the drones. That is a Ukrainian officer describing his opponent, and it should be weighed that way, but it matches what Western analysts have documented independently. The method works, up to a point. Infiltration groups have pushed 1 to 2.5 miles ahead of the lines around Kostiantynivka, established nests, and launched their own drones from them. What it cannot do is take a city. The positions it seizes are abandoned or degraded ones, and they can be cleaned out. Ukraine's counterattack in May of 2026 cleared close to 100 square miles taken by infiltration groups. When Russian commanders do try the old way, the result is the assault near Shakov on the 22nd of July 2026. The largest mechanized push in months, repelled, with 7 tanks and more than 150 men lost by Ukrainian open-source accounting. Doctrine explains why. Infiltration brings no armor, no engineer breaching, no concentrated fire at a point of rupture, none of the storm detachments mass. It disorganizes a defense, it does not break a prepared one, and it cannot hold what it enters. The thing that made the old way unaffordable sits between the two armies. The drone kill zone runs about 9 miles deep by Financial Times and Reuters accounting, and 15 miles or more on both sides according to Robert Brovdy, call sign Magyar, who commands Ukraine's unmanned systems forces. Fiber optic drones doubled their reach from 6 to 12 miles in early 2025 to around 25 miles by early 2026. That zone does not stop at the front. Ukrainian strikes have been mapped as far as 185 miles back, aimed at Russian logistics and particularly at fuel trucks. 20 trains have been hit since January of 2026, many of them carrying fuel. George Barros of ISW has argued that pushing the kill zone out to 30 miles would deny Russia the infiltration method itself. The two methods do not cost the same to run. A mechanized assault carries 3 days of fuel and then needs the tanker columns and the rail behind it. 2 to 5 men on foot carry what a man can carry. Russia is fighting the way it can still afford to fight, and the supply line for the other way now has to cross 185 miles of hunted ground, which leads to the uncomfortable part. Of everything Russia has spent in the Donbas this year, one input is being replaced at scale: men. And barely. CSIS puts Russian casualties above 30,000 a month against recruitment of roughly 27,000 a month in 2026, an independent estimate, and a deficit. The sign-up bonus has been raised to 2 million rubles, about $20,800. Alongside a referral scheme observers have compared to multi-level marketing. Armor is not being replaced at that rate. More than half of Russia's depot reserves have been consumed. A satellite count published in June by the open-source analyst known as Jompy found 2,088 tanks across 9 storage bases, of which roughly 851 looked usable, with the T-80B and T-80BV series exhausted from long-term storage. Oryx's photographic count puts total Russian tank losses above 4,350 since February of 2022. The honest counterpoint: refurbishing the T-72A opens up something like 1,000 more hulls, and 2026 has seen fewer Russian armor losses precisely because the armor stopped going out. The depletion is sliding, not finished. Above all of it sits a reporting problem. The Financial Times reported in December of 2025 that officials hand Putin a rosy picture, inflating Ukrainian losses, minimizing Russian failures, with Valery Gerasimov, chief of the General Staff, responsible for the briefings. That is journalism, not established fact, but Russian military bloggers have made the same complaint in public, objecting to pretty reports and to cities logged as taken on credit that become the basis for the next operational plan. ISW has recorded aggrandizing briefings to Putin at least once a month since January. An army that cannot rebuild its mechanized mass and cannot get an accurate map is not an army that corrects itself. The map is where the structural damage shows. In April and May of 2026, Russian-held territory shrank, a net loss of about 155 square miles, the first monthly net loss since August of 2024. The case against overstating it comes from Carnegie, which calls the refinery race open, and from analysts who point out that Russian armor is depleted, not gone. ISW's own conclusion is the most restrained and the most damning. At the current rate, it is not prepared to assess that Russia can take all of Donetsk oblast on any timeline. The drone zone broke the mechanized assault. The burning refineries and the burning fuel trains are why the mass that made it possible is not coming back. Russia can still find the men. What it cannot find is a cracking unit it is allowed to buy, a fuel train that survives the last 185 miles or 100 yards a day that adds up to a province.